So, okay, we're talking about a meeting today. And to set the scene, this was all happening in a room in a university, and it's early evening, and they've got snacks and drinks, and everybody's kind of talking and laughing a lot. And everybody's more or less oriented towards, like there's a whiteboard on one side of the room, and people stand up and write on it and talk about the writing. It seems like there are two of them who are doing a lot of the talking and tend to be next to the board, so everybody's facing them.
So does it seem like they're in charge?
I mean, not really. People interrupt them and talk over them, so it doesn't seem like they're afforded more power or anything. And it's not all them giving the explanation. You can see F explaining something here, and I think that's also what's happening with D there, and E up here. And you get C asking a question here, and A asking questions to the room, like here, and to B here. And those get answered by B and F, so it's pretty sort of mixed. I guess not quite equal though. I just get the feeling that maybe those two people, A and B, they have more to say this time. But everybody's chipping in, so...
Right, so there isn't a clear agreement that a particular person should be listened to the most. But instead it's something like, if you feel that you can explain something or have a query and you feel empowered by that contribution to speak, something like that. This is kind of tricky, so we're supposed to be describing this as being the first time through, right?
Yes, which is hard. We're supposed to try to look at what's actually being done by the people in the room, as though it's the first time anybody's ever done this, and try to set aside our preconceptions about what's happening wherever possible.
Yes, that's perhaps even harder. Let's see how it goes. It would be nice to try to make a note of everything we find ourselves using to make sense of what's going on, like every time we find ourselves using a new resource like papers or things we remember about mathematics.
Yes, great. And the group uses different things during the meeting too, like papers and diagrams in their shared Dropbox and what's on the board and so on. So we'll start out with this text transcript and our recreation of what was on the board. So they've drawn some things on the board when this clip starts. There are numbers and letters and arrows and boxes, and they don't actually write anything during this excerpt, so it just looks like this. And it starts off with B right at the beginning, making a statement, saying, the thing that's bad is...
So what's B talking about? The thing that's bad? Is this some kind of Saxion it? I'm thinking of the kind described by Garfinkel and et al. In the paper about pulsar discovery, attributed to an unpublished lecture by Oliver Sacks before he died. So that's where an it is mentioned, recognised and understood in the course of a conversation, while it's still very much an unknown thing, and it's known to be an unknown thing, and so the word is sort of vague and undefined, but is still also this very essential tool for the speakers to be able to talk about something and thus come to define it.
Ah, that's interesting. They do seem to be finding a way to describe the thing that's bad, working toward a statement of a definition maybe. So B says this in the first line. The thing that's bad is a vertex with 3 switching vertices. And then here, C just repeats it, wanting clarification, I think.
Yeah, C just repeats it in a questioning tone, just reframes the same thing as a question. But we can guess that C's asking B to expand. It's like saying, tell me more about this. So then F starts explaining, and then here, F is using the word we, saying we have nowhere.
Right, so we get this kind of collaborative feel to what they're doing here. And in this animation of the gestures, we can see B go up to this picture, this diagram here, and follow along. And F is mentioning letters, and B is following the lines that are labelled with those letters. So it's connected with the diagram here in some way.
Oh, and so F is explaining, like describing something, talking through an example maybe, to explain what B means, to exhibit what's bad maybe, to show the badness.
Right, so it's kind of this team effort between F and B. There's this shared understanding, and they want to explain it, I guess, in multiple ways at once, with words and with waving at the picture. And it's important to them to share their understanding with C. And this understanding, it has to do with this. They want to convey it by talking about this picture. It happens between them and the picture. And each individual needs to have a part in this shared understanding. Okay, so we have the sense that in this first section, B has proposed some kind of statement of a definition for what's bad. And C asked for clarification, and then F and B sort of work together to exhibit this diagram in the centre as providing support for that definition. I don't think we're quite able to see how that works yet.
Yeah, agreed. Well, let's look at what happens next.
Then things get more complicated because then we have, so on line 14 here, A says, I have a problem. And then everything gets kind of chaotic. There's laughing, it's obviously quite informal. And then A walks up to the board and starts pointing at this other diagram here.
Wait, why are you saying diagram? And how can you tell that they're separated out like that?
Yeah, good question. So they just look like diagrams. What does that mean? They're simple, and there are arrows and relationships between elements. I've seen things like this before called diagrams. And there are labels. You get points and dots, and those have a recognizable character next to them so you can easily refer to them, like they do in these two lines, using the labels. So it's like a network, and there are kind of four collections of connected things here.
So what do you mean by diagram? What is it that you think these images are doing here?
I guess they seem kind of like tools for reasoning, like an image that is useful for organizing thought rather than, having an aesthetic purpose or something. It's something that people can use, so you interact with it as you're thinking or as you're talking.
Or if it were an engine diagram as you were working on it.
Right. So they have this functional aspect, and the way they're drawn is supposed to make something easier somehow.
Okay, good. So A walks up to the board.
Right, and starts pointing at the other diagram, waving A's arms around it. It seems as though A is talking about it, directing action at this diagram. And it sounds like a continuation, not so much like a change of topic.
Okay, so B makes this one clear statement at the beginning, and then A says, I have a problem. And this is announced with the same kind of gravity, emphasis, loud voice, waiting for people to stop talking, that kind of thing. So it seems kind of like a statement put on the same level as B's first one, like it's a response maybe. But then A is not pointing at the same diagram.
So A could be exhibiting badness in the other diagram, but that doesn't seem right somehow. It's more like a contradiction.
Right, so talking about something that exists somehow between the diagrams. Perhaps the bad thing is in one and not in the other. And that's what they want to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, and this announcement has quite an impact, right? B says, oh God. E says, not again.
Yeah, they're acting like it's a disaster. And then they say, what was it? Here comes another one of A's counterexamples. But they're not serious about that. They're kind of doing this cartoon, oh God response, like they pretend they hate A for it, but really this kind of setback is just part of the usual course of things.
Setback? Why do you say that?
I guess I get the sense that this is B suggesting something right here, and then A coming back with something that contradicts it. So it derails what the first person said. It messes up that suggestion, but it advances the group's work at the same time because it shows that there was something they weren't seeing.
So we think that it isn't just like a counter-argument. It might really disrupt things.
Right, it isn't just a difference of opinion.
Okay, so then what? Then things go kind of quiet, and A is trailed off, just kind of pointed and trailed off, and there's a silence. And then on line 26 here, B says, the problem is not for X. And A then says, oh. Like it seems like there's some kind of revelation, like B has talked A into something.
Yes, that seems right. Like that, like that saying not for X is enough to completely change A's understanding somehow, but I don't yet see how. Okay, so then what? Then B repeats the statement here.
Why does it seem like a statement?
Don't know. The phrasing has a kind of formality to it, starting with "if there exists," like that. It sounds as like something that you'd read written down in a paper, whereas everything else is so much more informal. It's kind of a switch in tone.
Oh, and you think the same is true of the first line?
Yeah, that seems less formal, I guess. There's a little of that in line 3, that it's so specific, so technical. But also in line 1, when it's introduced, B starts off with, "Alright, so," it's kind of like fanfare.
Sure. And this is perhaps, in that Garfinkel et al. Paper, they talk about identifying what the group does to extract the animal from the foliage, which, roughly speaking, is extracting the science from their various doings that night. So in that paper, they argue that atemporal properties of the pulsar were still established as an exhibitable thing by people doing things with equipment one night. So here, we want to see what they do to extract the mathematics from their exchanges, sketches and so on. The thing with wider use to the community that's produced according to the requirements and aims of the mathematical world. This fanfare seems like it's sort of signalling something, signalling an entry into mathematics.
Okay, so maybe we should see what they are working toward here and what kind of principles are employed in forming it. So some general thoughts. They're talking about how to define what's bad, I think, especially B's lines at the beginning and end. And then right at the end, A repeats what B has said, asking for an explanation, and B expands that bad. B replaces it with "the tree cannot be represented." So I think maybe when they talk about what's bad, they're talking about what cannot be represented, that there's a representation that you can't build for those cases.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one part of what they're doing is the group wants to be able to represent the tree, and not being able to do so is bad.
Right, and in another sense, their work is to find a statement of a definition for what's bad.
Okay, so what are they talking about here?
Well, I have some guesses, but we should mark this as bringing in a bit of general knowledge about the mathematical world, because some of this has to be confusing.
Alright, well, we both know a bit from experience about mathematics, from school and so on. Can we bring any of that to bear?
Yeah, okay, so they're talking about vertices and graphs and paths. A vertex is kind of like a corner, right?
Right. Right, an endpoint. Or like where two lines meet, I guess. And the mention of graphs, I don't know much about graphs, but I guess I can imagine these two diagrams being graphs. And I know there's a field of study called graph theory, so if there are people out there studying graphs and how they work, maybe that's what these people are doing.
Yes! Oh, and look at the other types of drawing over on the other side. There are two basic types of drawing here, and maybe they're studying how they relate to each other.
Right, but I think we'll have to look at the rest of the meeting to understand that. So what else do we have for mathematical terminology?
Oh, counterexample. On line 18. A counterexample is normally something that stands against something you're arguing for, that contradicts what you're saying by the fact that it exists. So when B says, "here comes a counterexample," maybe that means that B is imagining that A is about to come out with an example that contradicts B's original statement. And it kind of sounds like A has played that role before. They say, "here comes another one of A's counterexamples."
Ooh, that's helpful. And thinking about examples and counterexamples might help us to make sense of what the diagrams are there to do if they're both being discussed in the course of one piece of work.
Alright, so let's think about how much more we can work out on the basis of the rest of the meeting. So really just the conversations that were had on that same day in the same room. The first thing is these diagrams, some of them showed up at the same time as each other. You can see that in this chronological record of what was written up on the board when at this point. So first of all we got these two, and then this was drawn out, and then finally that was drawn.
Oh yeah, so we can see that there are two types of drawing, right? One with arrows and one with rectangles. And these two show up at the same time as each other. And then the two on the outside show up at the same time, more or less. Each one on the side. Arrows on the left, rectangles on the right. As well as the timing, we can see that the letter labels that we get here, 1, 2, X, Y, 1, 2, X, Y, they all appear in both of the outer diagrams. And then the inner one, A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, X, Y, oh, but no Z.
Oh, you remember XZ, FZ, we have nowhere to put Z on line 12.
Oh, right. Ooh. What does that mean, I wonder? And the same for the other two. So, yeah, like I said, we have X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 3, alpha, beta, gamma, delta. Wow, that's a mixture.
Oh yes, I think I remember them laughing about this. It's an unspoken rule. Normally you choose one alphabet or numbering system and stick to it, like Greek letters or Arabic numerals or whatever. So you use these systems so that everything gets a different label, but they're all taken from the same set, so that they're all kind of equal, you know? You can show that all of the vertices or whatever are of a kind, but they kept mixing them up and it really cracked everybody up because it was so against convention.
That's funny. They're supposed to be all of a kind, and kind of just messing around with that a little makes them so much more visible as markers.
Okay, so I'm getting the impression that for each arrow graph, there's a rectangle graph. They come in pairs like that.
Right, so what's the relationship?
Yeah, I think this comes up early on in the meeting, yeah. So here, about 7 minutes in, they talk about, so they were hoping that we could just convert it into a rectangle visibility graph. They could take an oriented path cover and convert it into a rectangle visibility graph, which is false. So there's some kind of conversion going on here.
Right, great. So you're thinking that they're saying that if you had a tree diagram, an oriented path cover, then it might be possible to draw a rectangle visibility graph that was somehow equivalent to it. An equivalence that has something to do with those labels that we were noticing that were the same. And looking at where those labels are, it looks like maybe each character is assigned to a point, a vertex, in the oriented path cover, and to a rectangle in the rectangle visibility graph. And in the tree diagram, they're connected by arrows, and in the rectangle one, they're connected by dotted lines.
Yes, and I think there's something about that here too. Further on in the same excerpt here, they keep talking about going from left to right. And they say arrows are always pointing from left to right in their representation. So while one type of diagram has directionality, the connection between the elements are directed, the other type, maybe it's just kind of built into their relative positions somehow. Let me show you by drawing over the lines. So I think it's about which one is lined up with which, like this. So it's kind of about which of them could see each other, like if they're all facing the same direction.
Except that rectangles don't have faces.
Except that rectangles don't have eyes, right? But it still makes sense, right? Like if you figure out who can see whom, and who's to the left, then it matches up here with the arrows. Like, so from this one, you have 2 arrows going in and 2 going out. See?
It's funny. I get what you mean about them seeing each other, but in the actual diagram you've drawn, they barely line up, or they do kind of line up when they aren't meant to.
Yes, but that doesn't seem to matter. The representation, it doesn't have to actually have the property.
Why not? Surely we want it to.
Well, I think that the point is that it's embedded in a discussion. Everybody's talking about it, and the diagram doesn't stand alone. It's something that happens in combination with a bunch of acting people.
Right, it's kind of like an assemblage made up of people and environment. So then when B says something about being able to convert it into a rectangle visibility graph, that might be what that's all about.
Right, so then I'm going to try it with the other graph, this one. So we have a starting rectangle, and then we have 3 more, C, B, C, D, and then I can put X here, so B, X, we can put Y here, so it's D, Y,
And then there's nowhere to put Z, just like F said on line 12.
right, and now we're getting a bit of sense to the idea that it isn't possible to represent the graph sometimes. The middle diagram here is there as a counterexample.
One of A's counterexamples.
So this is the original counterexample. A counterexample that means that you can't always represent a tree graph as a rectangle graph as they supposed. And I guess that when B is making these statements about what's bad, they're trying to define which tree graphs this won't work for. So in this diagram, there are 3 arrows coming out of one point, and then each one goes onto another arrow, and the arrows are pointing in different directions, right? So these 2 go both in, and these 2 go both in, and that one goes, those 2 go both out. So that means that when you do the rectangle version, they have to be 1 block to the left of the other and 1 block to the right of the other, and so on. And you can do that on either end of the rectangle, kind of loop around like this. But then after that, the 3rd time, there isn't anywhere to put it.
So you think that the basic aim here is to try to, you're calling this a counterexample, and you think it's an effort to somehow write down what it is.
A description of some property of the counterexample is connected to why it doesn't work.
Why it doesn't work? What do you mean by that?
Oh wow, I guess I don't know. I think I mean, okay, how about a description that would help you to know whether another example would work or wouldn't in advance? Or would let you know how to construct one that wouldn't work? How about that?
Yeah, that description is okay. I guess if we feel like we understand something, we feel like we can predict it.
Yeah. So I think, judging by B's attempts to make these neat statements, what they want is to write a kind of description. Here, it's a verbal description, a description of the non-working thing in the counterexample.
Yeah, and it's stated in this emphatic way. It's very brief, just a short sentence.
Right, so the exact wording is important. Actually, you can see similar short phrases repeated during the meeting over and over again. It's almost like they're adjusting it. So maybe adjusting the wording of the phrase they keep repeating is somehow keeping track of the shared understanding of the way that the group is looking at the example in this portable phrase that can be easily repeated.
Okay, so tell me more about these adjustments.
Alright, so here, B is saying the thing that's bad is a vertex with 3 switching vertices. Earlier on, we see this line here that talks about switching vertices. There's a change here, actually. So before this line, the group have been talking about switching paths, like in this part. And I think that by that they mean, so if you follow a line of arrows, you follow one to a point, and then the next, and then the next. And then the switching refers to the direction of the arrows, like whether it changes direction as you go along, like on this one.
Wait, what do you mean by changes direction? Relative to what? I understand what you mean as you go along, but why should it matter? I mean, it's changing direction relative to what?
Yeah, interesting. I'm not sure. I guess I'm talking about when 2 arrows point away from one another or towards one another. Actually, I think this is discussed earlier in the meeting. So they talk about it here a little, and then also here. They're talking about what counts as a switching path. Whether we have to channel from whatever vertex we're looking at all the way to a leaf before we decide whether it's switching. Does that count as one? I'm looking at that vertex. Does that count as one switching path or two? So they're talking about what counts as a switching path. I think it's relative to a thing they call a path cover, which I think is what decides where those arrows are pointing. Like on this. This is something from their Dropbox, which I think is the first, and oh yeah, and this one as well, which I think is the first presentation of the middle diagram here. The first thing they had trouble representing.
Right, I think I can see that, but what about where you count from, if you see what I mean?
Well, I think you can start anywhere actually. F says here, from whatever vertex we're looking at.
Okay, and then what counts as a path? A string like this? Then what happens if it branches?
Right, you have to decide where it ends and how to count them.
Oh, I see. So whether a path has to end at a leaf, which I take it is one of these endpoints here. And how many times you count it if it later branches.
And then there's a shift here to talking instead about switching vertices. The first time that a path switches, look. So they emphasize it, it's a total switch in focus. Are you doing what I think you're doing? So you're talking about vertices being switching. Vertices are being switching, and then you limit how many switching vertices there are.
Oh wow, okay, so by changing that word, a person is changing the focus from, rather than talking about a path, which might go from point X, Y, Z, beta, delta, they're talking instead about the switching being sort of decided at one point, like where the arrows point together or apart. It's localized at the first moment that it happens, as you encounter it from the starting vertex.
Right, so the switch in focus, it subtly evades those questions. And then I think that at the vertex with 3 switching vertices that B talks about, or it's a little clearer at the end, where B says, vertex from which 3 vertices are switching. B's emphasising that vertex, trying to say that it's a question of whether you can find any vertex anywhere with 3 of those first time switching vertices. And we just have to look for the first time it happens down a path, so the rest of the path isn't important. It changes what you look for. And it's not just the content of the statement, it's where the emphasis is placed.
And so on this example, we can follow this and say, so C is switching for A, D is switching for A, B is switching for A, just like F said.
And if there are 3 switching vertices coming off of one vertex, then we have nowhere to put Z.
The use of vertex to focus attention on the beginning. It reminds me of those eye tracking studies of Alfred Yarbus, showing how attention is directed when people are asked to answer certain questions about a picture. It's like a map of perception, being active and guided by the mind, guided by what you're looking for, even if you aren't that aware of it. So in a way, these subtle shifts in wording and emphasis are sending the group's eyes around and minds around the diagram, paying attention to different parts. They're an attention-directing narrative, and the diagram can be a very different thing depending on how you look at it.
Okay. The mathematical community. The mathematical community. Okay, so we think this connects up with graph theory, maybe.
Yeah, so have you heard of the Königsberg Bridge problem?
So that's the Russian city with an island and a river and 7 bridges, right?
Right, and the problem is trying to find out whether there's a route around the city that would cross each bridge only once. And nobody could find one, but nobody had been able to demonstrate that it wasn't possible at all until Euler found a way to study this and prove it in the 1730s.
Okay, so this here is supposed to be a kind of graph theory representation, right? with vertices and connected lines. So all the land masses are vertices, and each line is a bridge or a route.
Yeah, so then the city is represented as a graph, and then it's possible to say what can and can't be done with that graph. It's the study of those constructions.
Yeah, and I think they mention rectangle visibility graphs somewhere.
So if I search that phrase on Google Scholar, then I get some results. Bose, Dean, Hutchinson, Shermer. They say, here we are. They say, our goal is to find classes of graphs that are RVGs.
Okay, so it seems like some people are concerned with working out what can and can't be represented. But it looks like these are just done with lines, not arrows.
Okay, so there are a few things that look different.
And we don't know why. Should we ask C? Yes. So, there was something called bar visibility graphs, and then interval graphs. Rectangle visibility graphs were an extension of bar visibility graphs. I can give you some papers. There's a paper here on rectangle visibilities for graphs from about 1997. This is Dean and Hutchinson, which is probably roughly as old as the field is. Oh great, so we have here a couple from the 80s on bar visibility graphs, which are Wismath and Kirkpatrick and Wismath. Yeah, so they're a little different. For the bars, it's literally just bars like this. So they have no thickness. And then you only get visibility in one direction. Rectangle visibility, you have both. They can see each other from up here and down here. They were an extension from bar visibility graphs, which have been studied for a lot longer. Then you can put restrictions on this, like studying unit bar visibility graphs, where you can only use squares. And that restricts what you can do. Okay. I mean, it looked, in the diagrams we were looking at, like the rectangles weren't seeing each other. Like the rectangles weren't seeing each other from above or below, though. Yeah, because we were doing trees, we don't have any cycles. So I think that's why we're trying to avoid using up-down visibility. You have to kind of limit it so you don't get a cycle. That's just something that you can use when you need three to see each other, like if you have something like this. Ah, yes, I see. So now we have this 1997 paper. Here they say that their goal is to characterize those complete bipartite graphs that can be so represented. So working out which of these vertices and lines kinds of graphs can be represented as.
Can be represented like we can build a rectangle graph that has the same number of vertices related in ways that are parallel.
Right, can be represented as a rectangle visibility graph. That's the kind of thing that people study. Yes, and then we can say things about the properties of those rectangle visibility graphs, like how big they have to be to work. Also, I noticed that these graphs have lines rather than arrows. Yes, that's right. So we're using an oriented path cover, like for example this poster that our research group made here. That dealt with the area of the graphs if you made a rectangle visibility graph. Okay, just out of interest, what do these get used for? I mean, applications. Yeah, so a friend of mine who was also a student of my PhD advisor wrote this fantastic book called How to Guard an Art Gallery. So you can imagine a problem being that you have an arc arrow with certain rooms and you want the minimum number of guards, where do you position them so they can see all of the rooms? Yes, I see, that's great. Oh, and this chapter here starts with a Georgia O'Keeffe quote. I found I could say things with colours and shapes that I couldn't say any other way. I guess that's about reasoning with diagrams.
Yes, though I note that diagrams are sometimes rightly treated with suspicion in mathematics. When you're looking at a particular diagram, the particular features in the example you choose might give you a misleading impression about the general claims that can be made.
I noticed in this 1997 paper that reference is made to VLSI design. That's kind of circuit board design, right? I guess that makes sense as a useful application. Hey, thank you, C. That's been really helpful.
No problem. Yes, so let's reflect a moment. What kind of thing is it we've learned from talking to C?
I guess, and we know a lot more about the history, who else has done what and why. The why seems quite important. I've been interested to learn what kinds of questions people want to answer. What constitutes a contribution to this field?
Yup. And questions we have, like why there are arrows instead of lines, and why in these examples we're just using left to right visibility, how it relates to the other work. Those are really hard to answer because we don't have the right words to look them up. A broader picture of an assemblage might include the network of books, papers, online resources, and human repositories of knowledge.
Okay, so let's get into some of this detail. On lines 1 and 3, B proposes a statement of a definition of the restriction, a way to define which examples will be unrepresentable. C doesn't immediately accept the definition of the restriction.
Yeah, and then F jumps in and talks through the example.
So, a thing I want to talk about is the context that's shared by the group, this sort of shared landscape. So that includes what's been said in the conversation so far, their memory of previous meetings. I know they had some items in their shared Dropbox that we've seen already, diagrams they've made themselves and papers that they shared. Then there's also what's on the board in the room.
Yeah, so they have things they've all been looking at and thinking about, and a lot of it they all know that they've all seen it, if you see what I mean. They know what they've all seen.
Right, but they still don't really know all the same things. They have access to all this shared material, but they're only actually thinking about parts of it, and which parts each one of them is thinking about might differ. There will be differences even if they'd seen all the same material.
Like, if one person had really thought hard about one point and then had been eating snacks when another one was mentioned, or had worked on something else really recently that was related.
Right, and so here we can see that B, F and C aren't quite on the same page.
Okay, yeah, so then we can think a little bit about what F does to fix that. Let's look at this section. So F says B is switching for A, D is switching for A, and C is supposed to be switching for A. And B comes over and follows each line to show how it animates the diagram. B is switching for A, D is switching for A, and C is supposed to be switching for A. So that's interesting. It's the ordering of F's explanation that clarifies that it's the vertices, not the paths, that are switching, because of saying B, C, and D first. Listing each of these letters locates the problem in the points with those labels as opposed to the paths. And there's repetition. B is switching for A, D is switching for A, and C is supposed to be switching for A, with emphasis on B, D, and C, so we can see that it's the same each time. The emphasis is on the vertex. It's an attention-directing narration.
Right, and then so F simply lists each of the vertices and B just gestures to the same path. So what they're doing is taking the static diagram and animating it, making the first circle of vertices the focus and changing the role of the second circle to being just things that need to be placed.
Yes, so it's sort of filling out the diagram. They're using their engagement with the diagram to shape C's understanding of it and the statement of a definition that B gave. So F doesn't try to re-explain B's condition. Instead, F just tries to talk through the example to exhibit it as something that has certain features.
So, rather than further explicating the condition, F actually just identifies how the example meets it. The implication being that the example has 3 switching vertices and so cannot be represented. So F makes it clear that it's impossible in this case, and stating it narratively like that shows that the definition points to what makes it impossible. You get to switching vertex 3 and it fails. And now C can see that.
Yes, and the board nodes are in this shared space, and they're almost there for people to interact with. We can tell who's holding the baton, so to speak, because they're standing next to the board.
Right, so you and I right now are making sense of the diagrams by virtue of the way that they're used by the people. Like that this one is exhibiting a property that needs defining, and this one isn't exhibiting that property, and they've been placed here so that people can interact with them. Add bits and see what happens. Find different ways to pay attention to different parts. Physically interact with them. For their role in the assemblage. They're not just there to be decoded or read. They're external tools.
Yes, and it occurs to me that figuratively speaking, when the statements are proposed in these 2 lines, 1 and 3, and right at the end, they're also placed in a sort of shared space for the group to consider and critique, but are not set down on the board in the same way. The statements can be discussed while they're fresh in the group's memory, and that might be why they're stated over and over again. Since the work of the group is to refine the statement, this is continuously helpful.
So this seems to involve a kind of sharing of mental states, a physical enacting of an understanding such that others can access the speaker's very personal experience of what's going on and adopt it or act upon it or change it. An understanding is a very difficult thing to directly share, and this acting out on the diagram allows something like showing how you understand something to occur through intentional highlighting and guidance. The speakers performatively think through the problem, and as they do it, they talk through the process a little bit extra to make that thing feelable to the watching participants.
Okay, so then we have this, the problem is not for X. This part that we're not very sure about.
Yeah. So in lines 20 and 22, we have this interesting action by A. So A moves the focus back to the altitude diagram, so physically moving close to this part. And A says, so Z was switching. But what if it just continued this way and then switched, but then a couple of things switched all at and it seems to mime 2 coming down from above. So same here, we're seeing A sort of animate the diagram. A is talking about 2 coming down. I think the movements here are really important. A follows the line up, so it's asking about the continuation of a switching path, what happens after it's switched once, because B has changed the focus to the first switch, remember?
Right, and then the 2 from above, A is actually talking about a couple of things switching all at the same time. So really I think that A is asking a question about further switching downstream from an existing switching vertex. But A is kind of illustrating it by adding switching paths, not vertices. Because of this action, this miming 2 coming down from above. But that would only add 1 switching vertex.
Oh, I think I see what you mean. Yeah. But still, we can get the sense, I mean, A's worried about only counting this first one, about what happens afterward. It's still this question about how to count them.
Oh yes, but it's not as though A has said this exactly. It's more like kind of shared a way of looking at this diagram as having a path going up here and things happening later on. And it's kind of vague, but we can still kind of extrapolate from that what the miscommunication is.
Right, and then B kind of thinks about it for a while and just says, with emphasis, the problem is not for X. This is great. Earlier on, they'd been using X as the vertex they were tracing paths from, but now B is pointing out that it matters where you count it from. According to this new vertices description, if you introduced a bunch of new switching vertices up here, then if you were looking from X, then it wouldn't look like a problem, but it might do from a different vertex. It's yet another interesting question about counting, about how to count.
Oh yeah, and I'm finding it funny that you're inhabiting these vertices now. You're giving them perspective.
Yeah, and A was kind of caught in X's perspective. And B was trying to make the point that it doesn't matter which vertex it doesn't work for as long as there's one that it doesn't work for.
Okay, yeah. So it's this kind of subtle question about how to count them, which is a little hard to get at in words. It's really important for them to decide what gets counted and what doesn't. You can have a diagram with a whole load of arrows switching directions, and you can still build the rectangle version, and you can have a diagram with just a few switches of direction, and you can't build a rectangle. And they're just trying to find the right way of counting them, the right way to go through the diagram. Really literally, it seems. We can see how it's helping to direct their attention around this drawn picture and say, yes, this one has too many of the bad sort. No, this one actually doesn't, and should be fine.
Yeah, and then A wasn't seeing that it could be counted in this other way, and so B just says something really brief to contradict the assumption that A was making.
Right, so rather than saying you can start at any vertex, it's sort of as though B has just perceived A's picture of the problem as being kind of hooked on following lines from X. And so B just contradicts that one assumption, and then everything sort of hangs together in a different way for A.
Right, this is a really tricky one, huh? I think we've more or less understood it though.
What I like is that neither A nor B neither of them really states anything clearly. The actual words they utter don't explicitly say any of this. They make points in these really indirect ways, and yet it clearly works perfectly.
Right, and if A hadn't gone through the process of thinking out loud with the diagram, or just thinking through it but doing so in a way that's audible and visible, then B could not have got such a sense of where A's understanding was at, and been able to know what to say to change it. Thinking out loud sort of gives access to one another's mental states.
Yeah, so it was really as though A's thought process just happened for that moment externally, so that B could see it and replicate it, and so know how to alter it.
So, after this exchange, after helping A to see the condition the way that B was, then B restates it. B says, if there exists a vertex from which three vertices are switching, then it's bad. Then the whole graph's bad. So now emphasis is on that vertex just existing, wherever it might be. So now B is confident that A has seen it, then B tries to restate it as a sentence to find the right statement.
Right, and there's this, it's bad, the whole graph is bad. We should talk a bit about this term bad, this very emotive word that sort of refers to the work of the group, but also has a particular sense to do with the difficulty of building one of these rectangle graphs that's parallel to a tree graph.
Yeah, so in lines 1 to 3, bad referred to the local problem happening in a particular vertex. The badness isn't so much something that's happening in the whole graph, but is something that can't be done for the whole graph. The group want to be able to represent an entire graph, not just parts. So if a part doesn't work, that counts as the entire example not working for them.
Yeah, so in these two lines, 29 and 30, B aligns badness of one vertex with badness of the whole thing, but of a different kind. And A just asks for clarification again by repeating word for word like C did. The whole graph's bad.
Right, B is already thinking in terms of what can or can't be represented and evaluating everything relative to that goal. That's what B means by the whole graph's bad, which is understood at least by F. And that clarification, I think, it answers the question by finishing the sentence in a more statable way.
What do you mean by that?
wanted something that's kind of clearer, more formal, less dependent on the group's informal shared understanding, maybe more kind of portable.
Interesting. So these clarifications, this time the statement is restated in a way that sounds like it's closer to the language of a paper. But the condition is only stated as being from which three vertices are switching, which is only one particular case. And they've already said that anything more than two will do it, so it's still stated in a way that's closely tied to a particular example, this one.
Okay, so I just want to talk about valence language for a moment, like bad, and they use the word problem on 4 separate lines. Here on 14, on 16, on 24 and 26. But I get the impression that it actually means quite different things.
Okay, how so?
Well, on line 14, A is expressing a concern about B's statement, and I think it's used in the same spirit on 16 and 24. The 24 is less clear. But in 26, I think the problem seems to be within the example. It's about what's unrepresentable so that the statement holds. And it seems on paper kind of incredible that these people successfully arrive at these apparently opposite interpretations in such a short time.
Sure. I mean, it's a common word with lots of meanings. And when we hear it, we have to find the right one. I guess that must be through context, huh?
So that'll depend on things like how a word's been used recently, like a priming effect. But also in this context, there are multiple different meanings in a short space of time, so there must be something else, something like what kind of answer you're expecting, what's going to answer the question, what makes sense in the context.
Okay, so let's look at the context of each for a bit. So in each case, some kind of suggestion has just been tabled. So rather than here, let's say audiences, since this stuff is kind of directed to the room, so they're speaking those that the audience expects to hear something that's related to the context. In the first case, it's a problem with a statement that's just been presented to the room. In the second, it's a problem with representing the tree, which would mean that the statement actually holds.
Yeah, so their physical positions in the room seem to reinforce that. In 14, A is facing out into the room, and in 26, B has physically walked up to the diagram. B moves into the context of the diagram.
So looking at the context, the first two examples is talking about a flaw in the definition of unrepresentability, and the last one is talking about a property that makes something unrepresentable. So if we try to pin down what's meant in the first, it's something like objection to the definition or counterexample. We can call that problem 1. And the final usage narrows down to unrepresentability or specific locus of unrepresentability, and we can call it problem 2.
So they're really quite different, especially if you think about what's good for the group. The first usage, A's usage, really is a problem. It really is going to cause difficulty for the work of the group. But B's usage is to show that because the diagram has a problem, then there isn't a new difficulty for the group's work. It seems like a heck of a perspective shift to switch from what's a problem for us to what's a problem for the diagram.
Well, actually it's a bit more complicated than that, because that second usage references the context of the previous work, wherein A proposed a counterexample that they described as a problem that was a counterexample because it couldn't be represented. So that there's a shared context in which the word problem was recently used to refer to something that was contradicted an expectation, like problem 1, was unrepresentable, like problem 2, and was a problem for the group's progress. And that old usage kind of encapsulates the two new narrowings, so they aren't really that far apart.
Ah, so actually problem 2 is kind of an old problem as far as the group's concerned. Ha! It's changed from a problem for them, frustration and all, into just a word to use to talk about a property of a diagram. It's like they were in this world of trying to represent things as rectangle graphs, and in that world there was something that really was bad for their work, but now they've zoomed out into a world of trying to construct and evaluate statements of definitions, and there's a new sense of problem for the group evaluated relative to the new aim, but the old usage still persists.
It's like a sort of telescoping, zooming out but leaving traces behind. Words like bad or nice pop up all the time in mathematics with certain technical definitions. I wonder if this kind of thing is the reason.
Yes, and it strikes me that every time they're used, they still have this sense of referring to people trying to do things, and that might even help people to connect with the content, to inhabit it, to get a sense of what people are trying to achieve, to get the sense of how something fits in with the aim of a piece of work. If a term hints at the role something played in that history of endeavour, then so much the better for the person reading and trying to make sense of it.
Right, it seems relevant perhaps that there's evidence that really funny bits of polysemy can come into play in comprehension. There's been evidence that different but related meanings of words can prime one another for faster comprehension, and that this effect is dependent on whether the meanings are related. And then there's research showing really surprising stuff that seems to relate interestingly to these ideas about words with emotive content, like studies that show that positive valenced words are understood more quickly when they're positioned higher up on a page, and negative when they're positioned low down. That kind of thing can influence our interpretations in really subtle ways.
Yeah, and so bad started off being a value judgment. They were frustrated that the representation didn't work. And then right near the end of the meeting, we see this new, more formalised statement that they've settled on, which is still using the word bad.
Yeah, so should we take a look at that?
So as the meeting wears on, the group keeps stating and testing these sentences. And here they've come up with this. The tree cannot be represented if there's a vertex from which 3 vertices are switching.
Okay, and do they refine it any more after that? It would be interesting to see what they're aiming for, if you see what I mean, the animal from the foliage.
So at the close of the meeting, it's been refined into another line, which is here. I'm going to have to paraphrase a little bit, but it goes basically like, if there are no k-bad vertices for k greater than or equal to 3, then a certain algorithm works to convert this orienting path cover into a rectangle.
And we think that k-bad is vertices that lead to k switching vertices, where the switching vertex is the first vertex in the path to switch.
Yeah, so it's when they're more than 2 bad that it's a problem.
What was that? What was that? Too bad?
Oh yeah. Too bad. Yeah. So you could hear it as this, or this, or this. Spoken, it could be any of those. I guess that, I seem to remember the group also had difficulty with that. That spoken, it could be any of those. I guess that just goes to show that really the aim is really just to produce something that is in text form, something written. That's more important to them.
Oh, that's interesting. Writing trumps speaking.
Yes, and there's also, they talk all the time about producing a lemma, that the outcome is a lemma. Right here, from 12 minutes in here, so there's a lemma here, which is, suppose you have blah, 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 to write at the end. A proof of the lemma. They're aiming for a written form. What they have in mind throughout is how to produce it in a solidified, shareable form.
Yeah. This is actually also the mirror image of the draft statement that was being passed around during the meeting, stated in terms of what needs not to be the case for the graph to be represented, rather than what needs to be the case for the graph to be unrepresentable.
Oh, that's interesting. And before they wanted to exemplify what can't be represented, so they could stare at it, and that would be 3 or more. And now it's a statement about what can be done as long as it isn't 3 or more.
Why do you think that is?
Well, because now the statement isn't for knowing what can't be represented, it's for knowing what can. Because that's what they eventually want to do with the paper, that's what would interest or could be used by others to show what can be represented.
Oh, interesting. But now this sentence is more kind of convoluted, with this negation at the beginning, the focus of the sentence being elsewhere. Lakatos talks about this in Proofs and Refutations, how definitions get adjusted over time. They're the product of the efforts over time to find a proof. And this creates these intimidating, weird definitions where the thing you should focus on if you want to understand it is actually kind of obscured. In this case, it's just that the statement no longer points to the examples they were discussing. It points away from them.
Yes, and I think that probably affects how easy it is to make sense of these statements.
That might cast some light on what happens when language becomes more technical rather than conversational. Specialised formulations that have been subjected to these purposive adjustments are less intuitively framed than everyday speech, or just diverge more from ordinary communication the more it happens. And that might mean that successful interpretation becomes more reliant on conventional familiarity.
Purposive, like with a different purpose than conversational communication, like the usefulness to the community that we discussed. On the other hand, I quite like the way that their emotive descriptions have been baked in. The wording that refers to the history of the group's work, using bad as a term.
Yeah, the description used is k-bad vertices for k greater than or equal to 3, rather than simply greater than 2. This does still focus on the bad cases in the same way that the meeting did, taking a particular case that was 3 bad and examining it. It is interesting to look at the wording here, since there's nothing necessary about it. You could describe this problem in a multitude of different ways, like more than 2 folded vertices connected to one rectangle, maximum 2 double-ended vertices can be supported by one vertex. If we use some inventive Greek-based terminology from Homo for same and acri for tipped, we might say maximum 2 homoacrinous vertices can be held by one vertex.
Yep, at one point the group was calling them locations of incoherence.
Nice. But instead the language used throughout is that of switching, which it's a term that worked really well with the earlier path-based descriptions. It worked really well for the perspective-taking method of counting that they were talking about.
Yeah, so it's tied to the ways that these very human actors have been moving around these diagrams and how they've been helping each other to see them. There's a trace left behind. The sentence has in it this kind of record of the group's process of discovery and management of a counterexample, even in quite subtle ways.
That's an interesting way of seeing it. I suppose it's, if I were to describe it to you using the word switching, then maybe it already gives you a sense of following paths along and changing direction, more than folded or double-ended or homoacrinous.
Yes, so retaining the word switching might well be just enough to nudge a reader of the eventual paper into looking at a graph in a way that's rather like the way they were looking at it in the meeting, and so reaching an understanding that's kind of similar to theirs. And it isn't that the language here isn't technical enough somehow, it's just in the nature of technical language that it's born from this stepwise refinement of language, from situated impressionistic ways of communicating gradually towards something more general and portable that can become part of the community's work. It could be expressed otherwise, but the very small details of its expression might help or hinder the creation of shared understanding in subtle and generally unseen ways.
Especially if... So we basically think that the outcome of the work is this statement, right? That they were working toward this portable, repeatable statement, which was this way to direct attention around a whole set of possible examples, where they worked with these 2 examples, but they're supposed to stand in for all kinds of other graphs. And what they want is this short collection of words that will help somebody to see things or see the problem in the right way.
Yeah, though actually the reader of paper might never even care that much about which examples are excluded. The statement might just draw a line around what can be done, but it can be found again.
On the other hand, we were talking about how convoluted the statement had got, and Lakatos's observation about the development of definitions as they're passed around. And that's kind of unavoidable because mathematics is this collaborative activity across a whole big group.
Yes, the process of argument and counter-argument is greatly extended in the mathematical community. You see clarifications and counterexamples being traded over the course of many years, and definitions are greatly refined and developed by this process.
Okay, so are we finished?
I think so, more or less. We've gone through our own process of making sense of things and tried also to make sense of how our subjects understood one another.
Which I guess is sort of a shortcut to seeing more clearly how we understood what they were doing.
Right, and how we read them or read their actions in the shared environment as part of the people-environment assemblage. And we found that the subjects directed one another's attention around the shared materials in really subtle ways, even when what they were trying to convey was not something they could have paraphrased. It was more like sharing a mental state or a way of seeing. And encapsulating the way of seeing as a statement was part of the work of bringing the animals from the trees.
Right, but then as the group zoomed out from one field of inquiry to a broader one, the statement kind of solidified. The group still understood it, but this was rather more because they've repeated it and repeated it. They kind of knew it rather than understood it.
Right, and the statement became more of an artifact than the genuinely communicative, contextual utterance that they began with. And this may explain the sense that we had that writing trumps speaking in mathematics. If they were aiming toward a solidified, portable version in a paper, then the expectation that the written form is the defining one makes a lot of sense. And yet, still it bore the traces of this genuinely mental state sharing function it once had.
Right. And while we had access to the marks they'd made on the board and the words they'd said, it wasn't just understanding the definitions of all of those that helped us to understand what was going on. We spent most of this time talking about where the attention of the group was, what was being emphasised, and working out what would make sense as an answer given the group's particular aims and motivations.
Yes, so we've seen that what is being communicated goes far beyond the content of the diagrams or even of the sentences that are uttered. So neither of these really encapsulates it all. Rather, they're using these really subtle strategies to shift one another's way of seeing the problem.
Great. So shall we wrap up?
Sure. Till the next time.